April 1958. Barstow, California. A filling station on Route 66 at the western edge of the Mojave Desert, where the highway straightens out after the long grade down from Cajon Pass and the truckers finally ease off the brakes. The banker arrives at 9 in the morning with boards. His name was Warren Alcott, and he worked for the Mojave Valley Savings Bank. And he had brought 2 men with him who were not bank employees. They were day laborers he had hired to carry the lumber. Warren Alcott did not carry lumber himself. He carried a briefcase and a document folder, and he wore a gray suit with a white pocket square. Because Warren Alcott was the kind of man who dressed for an occasion, even when the occasion was boarding up another man's livelihood. He parked on the apron between the 2 pump islands and walked toward the station office without acknowledging the man who was standing in the bay door watching him come. Here is the story. The station had been Frank Aldridge's for 9 years. He had come back from Korea in 1952 with a Purple Heart citation from the 7th Infantry Division at the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, and a quietness that settled over him slowly during the first year home, and then became simply the way he was. He used the GI Bill and a $2,800 loan from his father to buy the station from a man who was retiring to Blythe, and he opened it in March of 1953 with 1 bay, 2 pumps, and a hand-painted sign above the office door that read Aldridge Full Service, because Frank believed full service meant something and intended to keep meaning it. Frank added a 2nd bay in 1955 when the business warranted it. He kept the bays clean, concrete scrubbed down every Friday evening, tools hung in their places on pegboard painted white so the outlines showed, nothing left on the floor that didn't belong there. The smell of the station was motor oil and rubber, and in the afternoons when the desert heat came off the asphalt and the bay doors stood open, something like warm iron, the particular smell of a working garage baking in the Mojave sun. There was a radio on the shelf above the parts drawers in the office, and it played all day. And most days nobody was listening to it. The pump handles were wiped every morning before Frank opened. The bathroom key hung on a nail beside the office window, and any driver who asked for it got it. Frank's father, Gene Aldridge, had co-signed the original station note. Gene died in January of 1958. At 73, peacefully, in his own bed in Victorville. Frank drove home for the funeral and was back at the station 2 days later, because the station did not run itself, and he had a mechanic named Stovall who was good but not good enough to be left alone with the accounts. Warren Alcott wrote to Frank in February. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph expressed condolences regarding the death of Gene Aldridge. The second paragraph noted that Gene Aldridge had been co-signer on the station note, and that the terms of the note specified that in the event of a co-signer's death, the primary borrower had 60 days to either provide a new qualified co-signer or retire the outstanding balance in full. The third paragraph stated the outstanding balance. It was $7,200 and change. Frank Aldridge had run that station for 5 years without missing a payment. He had never been more than 3 days late. He had paid down $4,800 of the original note, which meant the station was more than half his and less than half the bank's, and Warren Alcott's letter was telling him that the death of the man who had signed beside him 5 years ago now entitled the bank to call the whole remaining balance or take the property. Have you ever known a man who built something clean and kept it clean year after year, through the hot summers and the slow winters and the years when the margin was thin and the work was the only thing that kept the whole thing going? Some of you have stopped at a station like this one. Some of you know exactly what it felt like to pull off Route 66 on a hot afternoon and have a man come out of the bay wiping his hands on a rag and ask what you needed. Frank could not produce a new co-signer in 60 days. His mother was alive, but her finances were not sufficient. His one brother was in the Navy. He went to 3 people in Barstow who he thought might qualify. 2 said they were sorry. 1 said yes, and then called back the following week to say his wife had said no, and he was sorry too. He went to the Mojave Valley Savings Bank and sat across the desk from Warren Alcott and asked for an extension on the 60-day window. Warren Alcott said the terms of the note did not provide for extensions in this circumstance. He said it without any particular pleasure and without any particular regret, which was in some ways worse than either. The 60 days ran out on March 31st. Warren Alcott arrived on the morning of April 4th with his document folder and his 2 hired men and their boards. He served the notice of repossession on Frank Aldridge at 9:02 in the morning, which Frank accepted and read and set on the counter beside the register with his hands still flat on the counter, and then he looked at Warren Alcott, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say. Warren Alcott nodded once, the nod of a man completing a transaction, and turned to the 2 hired men and told them to start with the bay doors. Frank Aldridge walked to the far pump island and stood with his back to the station, looking out at Route 66, his hands in his pockets. Cars went by. Nobody stopped. Stovall had come out of the second bay and was standing at the corner of the building. The woman from the diner across the highway had appeared in her doorway. Neither of them moved. Everybody there could see what was happening, and not one of them could do anything about it. And they all knew it, and they stood still the way people stand when the thing they are watching is already over. You know that stillness. The kind that settles when the wrong thing is being done correctly and by the book, and there is no rule left to appeal to. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The man who had pulled off Route 66 at 8:50 that morning was driving a dusty dark blue pickup with a sleeping bag rolled in the bed and a toolbox tied down with a length of rope. He had pulled in for gas and told Frank Aldridge he also had a knock in the front left that had been with him since Flagstaff, and Frank had said he could take a look if the man had 20 minutes. The man had said he had 20 minutes. He was leaning against the front fender of the truck in the second bay, watching Frank work, when Warren Alcott arrived. He had stayed in the bay. He had not come out when the notice was served. He had listened. Now, he came out. He walked to where Frank Aldridge was standing at the pump island, not hurrying, and he stood beside him looking out at Route 66 for a moment. He did not speak first. He gave Frank the moment. Then he said, quietly, without turning, "How much?" Frank said, $7,200 and change. The man nodded once. He looked at the 2 hired laborers who had the lumber stacked and were fitting the first board against the near bay door. He looked at Warren Alcott, who was checking something in his document folder. He said, "Give me 5 minutes." He went back into the bay. He was in there for 4 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying an envelope, the plain white kind, the working kind, and he walked across the apron directly to Warren Alcott, and he held it out. Warren Alcott looked at the envelope. He looked at the man. He did not take it immediately, which was his way of establishing that whatever was happening on his schedule, and not someone else's. The man said, "There's $7,300 in that envelope. That covers the outstanding note and the month's interest that's accrued since the notice. I'd like a receipt." Warren Alcott's face did the thing that faces do when a situation has moved without permission. It held for a moment longer than it should have, and then it adjusted. He said, "The terms of the note require a qualified." The man said, "The terms of the note require the outstanding balance." "I just gave you the outstanding balance." His voice was level, 1 sentence at a time. He did not look away. Warren Alcott opened the envelope. He counted it with the folder as a writing surface, standing in the middle of the station apron in his gray suit. He recounted it. He wrote the receipt himself in his own hand because he had not brought anyone else who could, and he gave it to Frank Aldridge rather than to the man who had paid, because the note was Frank's name and the receipt was Frank's business. He told the two hired men they were done for the day. He got in his car. He drove out of the apron without looking back, and the lumber went with him, and the boards that had already been fitted against the bay door were pulled away, and the bay door went back up. And that was the end of that. Frank Aldridge stood in his apron with the receipt in his hand and looked at it for a while. He said, "I don't know how to." The man said, "The knock is a worn front left wheel bearing. I've got a replacement in the toolbox that'll fit. Let me put it in, and we'll call it square." Frank Aldridge looked at him. The man had his hat in his hand, and he was already walking back toward the bay. Frank replaced the bearing. It took 40 minutes. The man watched and handed tools when asked. When it was done, he paid for the gas he had taken at the pump, correct to the cent. And he shook Frank's hand, and he got in the truck and pulled back out onto Route 66, heading west toward Barstow proper. And Stovall watched the truck until it was out of sight. And then Stovall went back into the second bay without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. Frank Aldridge ran that station for 24 more years. He paid the station note off completely in 1965, 4 years ahead of schedule. In 1961, he added a third bay, which he needed, because the trade had grown past 2. He hired a second mechanic in 1963, a young man named Reyes from Barstow proper, and paid him what the work was worth, and kept him for 11 years. Stovall retired in 1967, and Frank gave him a send-off that lasted all of Saturday and involved most of the regulars from the station and the diner across the highway. And Stovall's wife said it was the finest retirement she had ever seen for a man who had spent 30 years under cars. Frank's son, Danny, started working the pumps on weekends in 1966 when he was 14, and was full-time by 1970 when he was 18. Frank handed the station to Danny in 1982, which was the same year Danny's own son was born. And Danny ran it until the 2000s. When the bypass finally pulled the long-haul traffic away from that stretch of 66, and the trade no longer supported 3 bays. Consider what $7,300 in cash on a station apron in April of 1958 built into. Frank ran the station from 1953 through 1982, 29 years. Danny ran it after that, another 2 decades. Between father and son, that filling station on Route 66 at the western edge of the Mojave served the highway for more than 50 years. 3 bays where there had been 1, 2 mechanics where there had been Frank alone. A son who grew up knowing how to work and what work was worth and what it meant to keep a clean shop and honor a handshake. The note paid off completely in 1965. 4 years early, on a station that was more than half Frank's the morning the banker came with his boards, and would have been none of Frank's by noon if nobody had moved. The outstanding note in April 1958 was $7,200 in change. The man pulled $7,300 from a toolbox in a bay on a Tuesday morning and paid it at the pump island, and then went back in and replaced a wheel bearing. And from that morning, a family business ran for half a century on a road that needed people who knew what full service meant and intended to keep on meaning it. In the second bay of what was the Aldridge station, it is a tire shop now, under different ownership since 2008. But the structure is original concrete block, the same bays. On the wall beside the pegboard where Frank Aldridge kept his tools, there is a framed piece of paper. Danny framed it when he took over in 1982 and put it where Frank had put the original note holder, on the wall beside the pegboard, at eye level when you are standing at the workbench. The paper is the receipt Warren Alcott wrote in his own hand on April 4, 1958, on the back of a page from his document folder. Because he had no proper receipt paper with him, and it reads, "Received in full, $7,300, Aldridge note," and below that Warren Alcott's signature. Precise and unhurried, the signature of a man who still believed in appearances, even when the appearance he was maintaining was capitulation. The afternoon light comes through the high bay window on the west wall and falls across the receipt for about an hour each afternoon before it moves on. The pegboard outlines are still painted white. Some of the tool hooks are the original ones. If you pass through Barstow on Old 66 and turn onto the service road that runs parallel to the highway on the west side, the building is the second one in from the corner. Tan block with a flat roof and 3 bay doors. The sign above the doors says something different now, but the building knows what it was. If the bay doors are open and someone is working, you can see the receipt on the wall from the apron. It has not moved since 1982. Some of you have known a man who built something with his hands and his GI Bill money and kept it running through every lean year without asking for anything. This story is for them. John Wayne never told anyone, not the name Aldridge, not the amount in the envelope, not the road, not the state, not the station. He drove west out of that apron and was in Barstow proper before the afternoon trade started, and nobody on that trip or any trip after heard him speak of a filling station in the Mojave. There is no entry in any letter that has ever come to light. There is no account in any interview. What is known is what Stovall told Danny in 1978, 20 years on, sitting in the station office on a slow Tuesday afternoon with a radio playing something nobody was listening to. The way Stovall occasionally told Danny things he thought Danny ought to know before Stovall was gone. And what Danny wrote in the back of the shop's service ledger that night. In the same ledger Frank had started in 1953, and Danny had continued without changing the format, because some things you do not change. A man pulled off Route 66 for gas and a knock in the front left. He listened to what was happening in the bay. He went to his toolbox. He walked across an apron and held out an envelope and said one sentence. And then he went back to the bay and fixed a wheel bearing and drove west. He did not explain. He did not need to. Some things are worth exactly what they cost, and nothing more needs to be said about them. The road keeps going. The work keeps getting done. That is most of how it ever got out at all. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There is another one like it every week. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.